Congratulations.
Thank you. I'm sending people to log in.
Right.
I know I'm crazy, but please indulge me while I drink my coffee. I'm on a silver platter.
Right, exactly. So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Adrian Hagerbrook, and I have the great fortune of having the opportunity to moderate this panel for you this afternoon. A couple of things that I want to just note very quickly. As you continue to eat, please realize that none of the three of us have eaten yet. And so our plates are actually staring right at us. So this might be the shortest panel discussion you've ever seen. Or you might notice us sort of nibbling at our fingernails or something. But we'll be okay, I promise you that. But the focus of this panel is really talking about the importance of innovation within the context of expanding learning and mentoring and other learning opportunities for students in school communities. And so keep that part of your frame of reference as we think about this. One of the operational words within this objective is innovation. And so how do we think about innovation? And I would posit that if I were to ask 5 of you to define innovation, you might come up with 5 very different definitions for that. But one thing that we should understand, or at least should consider, is that innovation has 2 elements to it. That innovation is a product or a result of something, but that innovation can also be a process towards something. So it has 2 elements to it, the result and the process. As a product or a result, it's a new idea, a new device, a new methodology. But as a process, it's more of the act or the process of getting to that new idea, that new device, or that new methodology. Sometimes we can wax eloquently about innovation, and we come up with things such as innovation distinguishes between a leader and a follower. That's what Steve Jobs said. Or we might say, for good ideas and true innovation, you need human interaction, conflict, argument, and debate. And I think in a lot of spaces we get that one right. And then another way that we think about innovation is that we put a qualifier in front of it, and we talk about disruptive innovation, or disciplined innovation, or sustaining innovation, breakthrough innovation, new market innovation. But we would all have very different ideas about our definition of innovation. And so what we wanted to do this afternoon was to frame some time for us to discuss and engage with one another around this whole notion of the role of innovation, the importance of innovation in really thinking about expanding learning and mentoring opportunities with those that we serve in the communities in which we serve. And so in doing so, we have brought together a panel who will really help us in sort of distinguishing that. But as I introduce them to you, the format that we would love to use is to really see this as a conversation. You've seen us already laughing and joking. We were joking earlier about this particular innovation, that there's a doily that's actually sewn to the bottom of this cup so that as we drink, it doesn't spill on our papers or our laps. Salud. Cheers. So engage with us. We've got a couple of sort of framing pieces that we'll start with, but at any time during our conversation, please ask questions, and that there are those who are around with microphones who will bring the mic to you. But we want you to engage with us in the same way that we want to engage with you, and also engage with one another. And so I have the real privilege of introducing 2 very good friends now in the short period of time that we've had together. Nadia Chinyoy Dabi, who is the Assistant Deputy Secretary for Innovation and Improvement with the U.S. Department of Education. In her role, she oversees 25 grant programs that includes education innovation, personalized learning technology, and STEM. She also serves as the leading voice in the federal government's role in promoting innovation and on key administration policies such as evidence and place-based funding. Previously to this role, she served as the Assistant Deputy Secretary for Innovation and Improvement, also with the department. And then you've already been introduced to the Deputy Mayor of New York City, Richard Bury. As said, he was appointed by Mayor de Blasio in March 2014, and he leads priority interagency efforts, including the Mayor's Signature Initiative, to develop community schools and expand after-school programs for middle school students. In 2009, and you can see this in his bio as well, he was named President and Chief Executive Officer of the Children's Aid Society, the first person of color, the first black leader since its founding in 1853. And as already mentioned, he's founded several organizations in his work. And so what I'd love to have them do is, that's just a summary, but what I'd love for them to do is just to begin this conversation with a bit of their own journey, but in part of that journey in their work, to also share how they define innovation, and then we'll lead from there. Nadia.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Adrian. It's great to be here. A little bit about my own journey, and it's funny, I'm trying to get in a sort of better habit of incorporating my own story into this work, but I am a product of public education. I went to public schools from kindergarten through graduate school, all in the state of California, back when California was a little bit better than it is these days, but probably not outstanding. And I actually went to a school that was a dropout factory, so most of my closest friends from what was then junior high, not middle school, didn't actually make it through high school. I actually recently went to a high school reunion of mine, and one of the things I was thinking about a lot before I went to that reunion was this question around what were we going to do at our reunion to acknowledge all of the people that weren't there? And so some of those people weren't there because they have passed away, some of those people aren't there because they are in prison, some of those people aren't there because they have lives that kind of prohibit them from being there in very complicated ways. And sort of in retrospect, we didn't actually do that because there's actually no way to do that. There's sort of no way to actually really, in some meaningful way, sort of honor the toll that should honor the price that a lot of our kids pay for a lot of the things that we as adults get wrong over and over again. And what I was struck by was how normal it was for me to kind of think this through and think, oh, this is reasonable that a bunch of people that I went to high school with not only didn't graduate, but also can't be here. And sort of how are we just going to deal with that? And that seemed like a very reasonable question to me. And I am incredibly fortunate. I made it out. I did well for lots of different reasons, and I'm incredibly grateful for the opportunities that I've had. But I do this work very much because I am quite cognizant of the privilege that I enjoy, and I'm quite cognizant of what it means to not enjoy those privileges and to have your life turn out very differently. And so I think it's incredibly important that we all sort of honor that and recognize that, and I know you all share that same passion. I'm also very grateful to Adrian for introducing me because I have both a long name and a long title. And so it is helpful when someone else can go through those things. And to your question, my title includes the word innovation. And I think if you have the word innovation in your title, you are forced in some basic way to grapple with what you actually mean by innovation, because innovation is sort of one of those words that can mean anything to anyone. And so when we talk about it in the education context in particular, what we really mean, and we try to do this pretty consistently throughout our work across the Federal Department of Education, is something that is both better than the status quo, so it's actually an improvement, not just a neat idea, but something that quantifiably produces better results for kids and for our educators, depending on what that innovation is, and something that is either scalable or scaled. So having something cute and shiny that sort of sits in the corner is not actually where we're trying to get. And I wanted to sort of connect that back to a point that Adrian made around this question around processes can also be innovations. And we sometimes forget that. We sort of think of innovations as your iPhone. And that does something really exciting and amazing, and it does, and it has transformed a whole host of elements of our lives. But there's also a piece of innovation that is, in fact, about sort of different processes. And so scaling all by itself in our sector is an innovation. Each of you likely represent outstanding work that's happening, and likely many of us are doing that work at subscale for a whole host of reasons, not because we don't want to be at scale, not because we don't think about those issues, but because there are complicated sets of incentives in place, and frankly, because the work is hard. And so I think for us, it's really important that what we're talking about is both something that's better, but that's something that also really has the potential to reach all of those kids who so desperately need it.
So thank you all again. Great to be here. And we did not coordinate our responses, but my responses, I think, to both parts of those questions would be very similar to yours. My journey to get here has been that I think in my own life, the opportunity to serve others, to run programs for young people, it really, I think, gave me direction in my life when I was lacking direction. I grew up in Brooklyn, in a low-income section in Brooklyn called East New York, and was very lucky to go to high school at Stuyvesant High School, which is an examination school in Manhattan, which takes some of the best students from around the city. And going from East New York to Stuyvesant, it was my first time going to school with young people who were not black and Puerto Rican from neighborhoods like East New York and Bushwick and Brownsville and Bed-Stuy, back when those neighborhoods were not unaffordable the way they are now. So I think, yes, progress, the manner of speaking. And so for me, going to Stuyvesant was a really traumatic experience for me, because it was, so when the mayor, I said before, talked about A Tale of Two Cities, that was a campaign theme that really resonated for me in my own life, because I felt like I was living between these two cities. This first city in East New York, where young people did not have a fair opportunity to succeed, where schools were terrible, where even the air we breathed was terrible, where opportunity was limited, where fewer than 10% of young people went to college. And then this whole other city that I experienced at Stuyvesant, where not only were young people expected to succeed, but where they were given the tools to do so, where I went to a homeroom where 6 kids in my homeroom went to Harvard. I'm pretty sure there are states that don't deliver 6 kids to Harvard in a given year. So, I think that disconnect in my experience created a lot of anxiety for me in a lot of ways. But I was really, I would say, saved by the opportunity to serve others. And in college, I was very lucky that a friend of mine one day invited me to go with her to volunteer at this after-school program in Roxbury. And I think I had a little crush on her, which is why I was willing to go. But I fell in love with this experience. It was working with elementary and middle school students at this housing project in Roxbury. And I went from sort of volunteering there one day a week to spending more time there than I did on the Harvard campus. And eventually, as we were talking about before, started a summer camp for kids who went to this housing development because the kids didn't have anything to do over the summer until we started a summer program for them. And so for me, I sort of come to the work, I think, in a very selfish way, because having that opportunity to feel like I can meaningfully contribute to the lives of other young people who reminded me of me, has really been the greatest joy of my life. And having that experience early, I think, was one of my greatest blessings, because I didn't have to spend a lot of time in my life figuring out about what I wanted to do with myself, because I was able to figure it out when I was in college. So in terms of innovation, I think my answer is sort of similar to yours. I guess I don't think so much about innovation as new programming and new ideas, though I'm sure there are lots of new programs and new ideas from which young people would benefit. But for the most part, I think we have pretty strong understandings about what young people need to benefit. I think in my world, innovation is about bringing things to scale and what you have to do to take great ideas and good ideas that we all know basically what they are, and how do you bring them to the majority of New Yorkers. And so, in this last year, we added 40,000 children. There are 40,000 middle schoolers who are in after school this year who weren't in after school last year in New York City, and there'll be another 20,000 next year. And figuring out how do you organize the apparatus of a city to do that, and to do that effectively, is to me where our innovation lies. And a colleague of, you heard from Chris Caruso before, but a colleague of ours, Bill Chung, who's a commissioner of the Department of Youth and Community Development, was able to build a system where a process that took 18 months, of sort of a proposal process that took 18 months before, took us 4.5 months to identify all these new providers and to get them up and running, because he was able to innovate in the way that the city contracts services. So, I mean, we can talk more about it, but I feel like that's where the innovation lies for us. It's unleashing the power and the talent of the city to deliver services at scale to young people who need it.
So it's interesting, in both of your comments, you talked about sort of a follow-up question that I would ask is, what are some of the essential elements of innovation? And you both talked about process and results, and you talked about the opportunity or the potential obligation to scale and replicate. And in many cases, that can be easily done. In other cases, it can be a challenge to get done. What potentially is the role of policy in really helping to bring that level of innovation around scale and replication to in a way that is beneficial? How do you think about that role?
So I guess one thing I would just note is that I think we often think that innovation happens in very particular places with very particular kinds of people. And I would just note that in my job, one of the best parts about it is I get to see all different pockets of this country, and there is amazing innovation that happens everywhere. And so it's true that there's a bunch of amazing stuff that happens in New York City. So for example, the New York City Department of Education, using funds of ours, ran a sort of prize program to get app developers to really develop the kinds of apps they needed to actually meet the needs of their kids and their students. That's great, that's an innovation. It's also true that in rural Tennessee, you can find a group of folks that are also innovating and trying to figure out how to get rural students that have not had access to rigorous coursework, meaningful access to AP courses, and a range of supports for their teachers to help them do that. It is also true, 2 weeks ago or so, I was in Miami and I was talking with a group of teachers, and they were talking about how they are now in a position, thanks to a particular grant that they received, where they actually understand what the central office expectations are of them, they understand the new standards that are in place, and they understand the supports that are available for them to help their kids meet those standards. And they do that in a routinized collegial way within their school. Now that sounds very straightforward and sounds like what we should have been doing all along, but it turns out to be extraordinarily difficult. And the fact that they have figured out how to do that is actually a huge innovation, even if it might not sound very glamorous. And so my point is that I think this innovation sort of happens all over the place, and I think as policymakers and funders, our job is in some way to kind of unleash that and to help grow and scale that. And I think people do that in all kinds of different ways. I think probably most importantly, both funding and policy have the ability to change some of the incentives in the system. And I think those incentives are really important. And so on our end, we think it's important to give teachers an incentive to kind of want to open up their doors, to want to do things differently, to be honest about the approach they're taking. Is it getting their kids where they need to be? And if not, how do we help them recalibrate accordingly? And not sort of come down hard on them, but actually say, great, you're learning. We're all learning together, and kind of how do we move forward? By the same token, how do we make sure that external folks, whether those are nonprofits or technology developers or whoever they are that are partnering with our schools and with our kids, how do we make sure that they have every incentive to think about, is the program that they are running the most cost-effective way to produce the biggest benefit for our students, whatever that effort is? And how do we change those incentives in an ongoing and routinized way that doesn't feel scary for people, I think is extraordinarily important. And as a federal funder, I feel that a large part of our role is really to make sure that people are actually sort of sharing and connecting on that work. So I think it's really important to make sure that each individual school or district or nonprofit or city is thinking about these questions, but we certainly would want people to be thinking about these questions together. So if everybody just has to figure this out all by themselves, that's a pretty inefficient way of doing things. And to the point earlier, because I think there is such interesting work that's happening in different pockets, a huge part of the work of policymakers is to surface that and to share that and help us all learn and grow together so we can do more of what we think is going to get us the best results.
Yeah, the only thing I would maybe add to that is one of the places that policy plays, and at least has played in New York City, I would always emphasize the critical importance of leadership and the role that leadership plays in allowing us to sort of unleash the creativity, and unleash the power, unleash the knowledge that already exists in our communities. So, you know, some of the things that I lead, as Lucy mentioned earlier, are pre-kindergarten expansion. You know, we're on a 2-year path to providing full-day pre-K to all New Yorkers, 4-year-olds, after-school expansion. In both these cases, there are lots of, I don't mean bureaucratic in a bad way, but there are bureaucratic obstacles to getting things done. There are a number of regulatory agencies involved at the city and state level. There are operational complications. There are ways in which individual agencies do things, government agencies, that can make it challenging for an individual provider to sort of connect the dots and to allow them to unleash their creativity, to allow them to do the great work with communities that they know how to do. And so one of the things that strong leadership does is it creates the ability to break through some of those barriers. And once, you know, the mayor says that, you know, I'm serious about making sure that there are an additional 40,000 children after school this year, I've staked my administration on it, and we're going to get this done. that leadership allows us to do things that would normally not be doable. And I think what we've also seen just in New York City is how the bureaucracies have responded to that so wonderfully. Because at the end of the day, these are public servants who really want to be a part of doing great things for communities. I think policy plays an important role. Obviously, a lot of policy leadership around resources, and a lot of this fight in New York has been about getting the money to do this work. But equally important has been having a leader who says that these things are critical to our city, they're central to the business of our city, and we're going to, hell or high water, we're going to accomplish these goals that we've set for ourselves.
So how many of you that are out there are serving, are direct service providers or programmers, and you're serving primarily young people in urban centers, just by a show of hands? How many of you are serving primarily those in rural settings?
Somebody just pretend and raise their hand.
Somebody. Thank you. So I won't go down the list now because I think that could be very. Is that telling? What does that tell us? One of the things that we often have said about policy, in particular, support of funding through policy and those kinds of things, is that sort of the formula for that is primarily based on concentration and density. And so then what happens to the rural West Virginia piece of innovation that you've just seen, because we have a tendency of thinking, New York and other places like that are getting, they're the ones who are advocating strongly, they're the ones who are leading on the policy front. I guess my question is, so how would someone who is serving in a rural setting see innovation in New York and adapt it for their work, but then also how might someone in West Virginia, how might we learn from a big city perspective, learn from what's happening in a rural West Virginia?
Sure. I guess I would widen that question in some way and say that I think that our shared task is really to think about what kinds of programs, processes, solutions, strategies, whatever you want to call them, work best for kids who need our help the most. And who those kids are in different communities looks different. But I think that we have to be absolutely explicit about that particular focus. I think if we think, okay, we're just going to do stuff and see who it works for, and kind of go from there, I think that we run a significant risk of replicating some of the inequities we currently see in our system. And so I think it's incumbent on all of us, and particularly for those of us at the policy level, to really think about what does it mean to make sure that our resources are very much focused on those most in need. And to your point, those can be in rural areas, those can be in urban areas, and we have to sort of think about what a range of solutions are that work across contexts. There isn't going to be one perfect solution. Nobody's here looking for the one perfect thing that's going to work everywhere for everyone. That's actually not a thing, and that actually in some way probably shouldn't be our goal anyhow. But trying to come up with what are a range of different sets of solutions, what's essentially the menu of options that will work best given your own context, your own resources, kind of what you're working with, and how do we give people kind of more flexibility and more room to make those changes and to adapt accordingly, I think is extraordinarily important. And I think in particular, to your specific question around how we think about folks that may be sort of a little bit left out of rooms like this, I think that in some way is very much part of our work, right? That we have to keep expanding those circles. And I think in particular, the federal government can play an important role in kind of sharing that kind of information, in highlighting those sorts of successes, so that we do see that there's interesting and important work that is relevant to a range of different students and families across the country that's happening in all sorts of different pockets. But in doing that, I think we have to get much more serious about actually measuring what's working, and sort of being much more meaningful about sort of why do we think it's working? What are the most important ingredients of this effort? We're doing 10 things. Well, maybe only 4 of them are really important. So maybe we should only keep doing those 4 things. Or maybe it works for this particular population for this particular reason. And so how do we untangle that so we actually understand the nuance behind those stories so we can help other people scale and grow? And I would just add here that I think often we, in particularly, can feel like everyone is sort of competing for the same set of resources. And there is certainly some truth to that. I think there's also some truth to the fact that if every organization who sits in this room got all of the money they could ever want, we would not necessarily be able to serve every single kid that needs to be served at the scale and the intensity that they need to be served. And so I think for us to continue to grow as a sector and to think of ourselves as sort of being stewards of these dollars and that having a responsibility to help other people engage in this work for exactly the sort of reason around scale, I think is also tremendously important.
You know, fortunately, since it only really matters what happened in New York City, the rest of that didn't really, not so important.
Until the Yankees play the Red Sox.
Not interested. Mets. Anyway, no. Look, I don't have a detailed perspective on what's happening. Man, my work has really been based in New York City. But what I will say is that I think the truth is, like you said, everything is different in every city. What happened in New York and what happened in Boston and what it means to bring these programs to quality and scale are going to be very different. The obstacles are different. The resources are different. I think what is universal is the importance of leadership that articulates these things as being critical. I think the particular challenges and resources you have, of course, vary from place to place. But I don't think there's anything fundamentally different about what young people need to be successful around the country. And what we really need is leadership at every level, the federal, state, and local level, to say that these things are the most important things we can do if we're serious about building a country that lives up to its ideals. And I think that truth is true in West Virginia and it's true in New York City.
So earlier, both of you talked a little bit about incentivizing. How do you incentivize innovation? And as you think about that, also think about how do you incentivize that kind of collaboration that allows for, you know, the synergies that raise better outcomes for more. How do you incentivize that? And what role potentially does policy play? What role is there in innovation to actually help facilitate that?
Well, I'm not sure if I understand the question, but let me try to answer and tell me if I'm getting at what you're saying. I mean, I think in New York City, I mean, one of the things that are been great about doing this work in New York City is that, you know, we don't start on a blank slate. There is a robust series of organizations, large and small, in New York City. There are advocacy organizations and committee organizations like TASC, like others. So there is an authentic community in New York City of those who have been committed to this work and driving this work for a long time. And much of what we did is really tap into that existing expertise. When we thought about, well, what would it take to bring this program at scale? What did it take financially? What did it take in terms of processes? You know, we didn't just sort of figure it out on our own. We went to the providers and asked them, as partners, you know, if we're trying to get from A to B, what do you need from us to get from A to B? And have tried to create that kind of ongoing dialogue so that we can continue to learn from the providers in the field about what does it take to be successful. So, you know, in terms of incentives, I don't feel like I think what we always try to do is we try to create fora, whether it's around community schools or pre-kindergarten, we try to create fora for providers to learn from each other and to collaborate from each other. We try to focus on systems that are celebrating everything we do and trying to create opportunities for everyone to be successful and learn from each other. And we do that in formal and informal ways. And so I don't feel like there's a real need to sort of create incentives for that. I think the people on the ground who are doing this work want to do it well. In many cases, are already organized themselves. And what we have to do is to sort of tap into those existing networks and to give them the resources and the access they need so that they can do what they do.
Mostly I'm excited that you just used the word fora as the plural of forum, because my mother actually insists on this fact, and it's generally sort of awkward, so well done.
My Latin teacher from 6th grade appreciates you.
So I think a big part of this is actually around transparency from a policy perspective. So what did we give people money to do? What did we think was going to happen? What did happen? And then how do we all learn from that in a way that sort of is going to push all of our bounds a little bit and going to make us all a little bit uncomfortable, right? So it's quite possible that we could push the bounds and say, great. So we run sort of our signature innovation program has a little under 150 grantees, about $1.2 billion in federal dollars, about $200 million in private dollars. I should add that a few of your sponsors of today's session are also grantees in that program, as is Children's Aid Society, as a host of other outstanding organizations that really represent a huge range of types of organizations, so brand new ones, ones that have been doing this work for a long time, school districts, just a wide range of organizations. And we have in that program asked everybody to undertake a rigorous independent evaluation of their efforts and set the expectation that people will share the data and the results of those rigorous evaluations publicly once those evaluations are complete. For those of you who don't spend a lot of time thinking about the mechanics of randomized control trials, I can sort of give you a brief highlight and say that most of those types of studies, sort of the gold standard in evidence, reveal that whatever you did didn't work. So there's about a 90% failure rate is what shows up. That's just sort of as a general rule of thumb, that's kind of where we are. And if you look at our overall results in education, people are trying lots of different things and doing lots of things. We have not necessarily moved the needle as dramatically as we would have liked to, particularly for our kids that need us the most. And I think we sort of know that people are putting lots of effort in, but we are not actually moving the needle as quickly as we would like to be, as much as we see really exciting pockets of improvement. So we have 1 million more Latino and African American kids in college since 2008. That's a big deal. That's a tremendous improvement. We still have a long way to go. And so I think the sort of transparency play of saying, great, what did we learn? What did that look like? I think it's easy to talk about in some way and seems intuitive and reasonable. It's also really complicated, right? It means that we as a funder and as a public entity run a risk of saying, did we fund a lot of things that didn't work? And maybe that's normal if there's a 90% failure rate, but still people expect us to do better than that, and kind of what does that look like? And if you're the organization and you did something and you took this risk and you kind of put your neck out there and you did this work to the best of your abilities with all of the right assumptions and it didn't pan out the way that we would have hoped, how do we make sure that that's not a big red X next to your name, right? How do we actually help you learn from that, help other people learn from that so nobody replicates kind of the mistakes that you made, but that you continue to grow and expand. The point isn't to say that you're a bad person or that you shouldn't have done this, but rather, great, now we know that, how do we build and learn from that? And I think transparency is incredibly important in helping us all do that. I think it also represents a bit of a culture change. And so for us to really kind of wade into that water together is an important step. And it's a complicated step, but one that we absolutely need to take.
Just if I could just add one, just to build on that very important idea, maybe just sort of a little bit of a cautionary note. I mean, I think there are a number of reasons why it's so critical to be as rigorous in the way that you're describing. It's important, of course, because in the world of limited resources, we want to drive resources to those strategies that can be most effective, obviously. It's important because in a world where not everybody believes in the importance of what we do, it's critical to build the case for why this work is so important. It's important because, you know, if we take seriously if we take our children seriously, we should take it seriously enough to always want to challenge ourselves to do better and to make sure that we're engaged in the best practices. So I think for all those reasons and everything you said, it's critical. And I just always want to strike a cautionary note in that, only to the extent, you know, I talked about having a boy who's in middle school now. I have 2 sons, and last weekend I literally spent my entire weekend on Saturday from 9 in the morning to 5 o'clock later to like 7 o'clock at night on Saturday, and then again from 7:30 in the morning on Sunday to 2 in the afternoon, literally shuttling my children from baseball practice to baseball to basketball. It was the longest 2 days. I could not wait for Monday. It was the longest 2 days of my life. But in shuttling the kids between all these sporting events, at no point did I ask the coaches in my kids' Little League or in the basketball league to demonstrate by evidence the impact of these experiences. And so I only say that to say that, you know, all of us understand that all young children benefit from engaging experiential activities. They benefit from what comes from being able to be on a team, the discipline, the disappointment, as my oldest son's team had lost every game by at least 9 games, by at least 9 points, literally, so far. Although he had a triple the other day. And sadly, even though they lost by 9 points, all he cared was that he had a triple. Which is maybe not the right lesson. But, you know, we don't really, I don't ask their coaches to show me evidence of the impact of these experiences. And so I think it's important that at the same time that we are driving rigor in all these activities, we don't lose sight of the fact that not every experience that we create for young people is going to be tied to or justified by experience. In the same way that my kids get to benefit from these experiences, poor kids should benefit too, without asking the Little League program to come up with evidence that they're having an impact on test scores or other opportunities.
And it seems to me that the balance between the two is that maybe in the work that we're doing, as you just said, that we're still trying to prove something. We're still trying to prove that it works, or that trying to prove that there are ways to gain those kinds of outcomes in those the type of achievement, and that there's still ears and eyes out there who do not believe or do not understand. And so it's how do you develop that narrative and the evidence that actually supports that. And so I think there's a both and with this, that if we believe that it works, then we know that it works, then we don't ask for the evidence, or we don't question that. And so you all are eating lunch, we're not, but please begin. Please know that it's time for you to ask questions of us as well, to engage in this question. And there's a hand up already. Right back here. Actually, if you can hold just for a second, this is being live streamed.
Thank you, Allison Overseth from Partnership for After School Education in New York. I'd like to get to your point on scale and really think about how you're defining scale, because you've mentioned specifically, I mean, all of you talking scale, but then your special programs for special kids or kids who are coming with specific challenges, and then you sound like we're getting individualized. So as you think about scale, particularly from the federal perspective here, help us define that. Help us, are we talking about models that look the exact same in Arkansas as they do in Ohio, or are we talking about different things that are learned that have elements that are similar? And then tied to that is when we talk scale, how do we assure quality? Because we know all of this goes away unless we have quality programs. Thank you.
So when we talk about scale, I mean, it's a sort of tricky one, right? One of the general difficulties of life in the federal government is you have to come up with a range of definitions and parameters that work in completely varied contexts, right? And with different state laws and different cultural expectations, and I mean, like, there are a lot of layers to that. And that's our job, so I don't say that out of because I'm asking for sympathy for that, but rather just to express that it's particularly challenging. And so it is kind of in that context that it is hard for us and sometimes prohibitive for us to be super specific about a definition about those sorts of things, because inevitably we will trip ourselves up in some sort of funny way that nobody quite thought about when everyone was sitting around the table talking about it. But in general, I think the general answer to your question is that I do think that what we're trying to get to is a universe where we are clear on what those sort of core ingredients are, and that those are relatively consistent in different locations, and knowing that there can be some variance, but a program that does teacher induction and a program that does principal training are two very different things, and we shouldn't think of one as the extension of the other. But trying to say, what are the key, most important elements that sort of are the essential ingredients to the success of the particular intervention or process or strategy? And then how do we make sure that that's happening, and to your question on scale, in sort of multiple regions? And so it's tricky, right? New York City has over 1 million kids. And so there are states that don't have over 1 million children, and so kind of exactly, again, to the point of exactly how you define what does it mean to be at scale in New York City versus what does it mean to be at scale in Kentucky are slightly different things. But for us, I think the point that's important about scale is making sure that we're talking about those core elements being relatively consistent in different contexts. So just being at scale in New York City is a feat and is really important. It is also important to think about what are those key ingredients that are important to be replicated when someone goes to do that work in Jacksonville, Florida, and what does that look like? And so I hope that gets a little bit kind of at your answer. I think if we kind of stay in this universe also where scale is defined solely by one organization doing things, I also think we will keep tripping ourselves up. And so I think a big part of our work around scale is also helping other people wade into this space and do some of this work, not in a way that trips everybody up, but in a way that actually expands our impact.
Very strong. Yes, here.
Hi, Martha Holly Myers from Higher Achievement. We've been talking a lot, particularly with our new I3 grant, and challenging ourselves to do our work differently and more. Where can we get inspiration from other sectors who have adopted really effective, innovative strategies and learn from them? You know, we're not going to be adopting maybe a public health strategy, but what are the systems and infrastructure behind a public health initiative that's really successful? And I'm wondering where you all have gotten inspiration from different sectors, where you see innovation and scale happening well, and what sort of kernels of that do you see that we can start employing more in the education space?
Sure. So I think we actually do look a fair bit to the health analogy and try to think about what are some of the lessons there. And two basic ones come to mind. So one is that we just underinvest in research and development as a sector. So we invest less than 1% of all education funding in research and development. For relatively stable industries, that tends to be in the low teens. For kind of rapidly expanding industries where you really want innovation to be kind of at the heart of your kind of engine of growth for a sector, it hovers kind of in the high teens, close to 20%. So we are way off in terms of the proportion that we invest in that area. And so I do think that kind of fundamentally makes a difference, because we don't sort of invest in saying we should have this be the kind of engine that propels us forward and kind of finds new paths and helps us do this work in better and easier and more impactful ways moving forward. So that's one thing that I think we've learned. I think the second is that there are a range of kind of mediating organizations and infrastructure that exist in other sectors that we are still building. And so, so folks that you tend to have big gaps between sort of what's happening in academic research and what's happening with the kind of most critical challenges that schools are dealing with or nonprofit providers dealing with. And sort of if one turns to the other, folks don't speak the same language, don't have a kind of an easy way to figure out what they should and shouldn't be doing. And in other sectors, there are rules, there are organizations, there are sort of benevolent folks that do a lot of that translational work to sort of take that information and make sure that it's relevant, make sure that it's consistent. And we just have not, kind of a little bit to the same point about investing, we haven't really invested in that infrastructure, and we have tended in some way to think of education in particular as a kind of cottage industry, and we have kind of historically had a kind of keep my door closed, I'm doing this work because I'm very committed and so I'm going to do what's best. And that only gets you so far. It's not that people aren't committed and people aren't doing the best that they possibly can, but if you really want to sort of transform what things look like and what opportunities look like, you do have to fling open your doors and do things differently. And I think having kind of folks around to kind of hold your hand and to kind of be the carrots and the sticks to do that work is really important, and we are not yet there in terms of that kind of infrastructure.
Go ahead.
Just two other thoughts when you were talking that. I'm sorry, two other things that occur to me or that we draw on a lot are both electoral politics and behavioral and sort of behavioral psychology. Because I think a lot of what we wind up doing are trying to get people to make choices or do things that they would not already or not otherwise do. So I think about our pre-kindergarten experience where we had to get an additional 30,000 families to sign up for pre-kindergarten. One of the insights we had is it's basically like a political campaign. In the political campaign, you identify all the people you want to act, you identify your voters. For us, it was identifying the parents of 4-year-olds, and you try to convince them to do something. In one case, voting, in our case, getting them to sign up for pre-kindergarten or after school. And so we wound up drawing on a lot of the lessons and strategies of electoral politics to try to get people to engage in these programs. And similarly, looking at behavioral psychology, thinking about what are the, whether it's from marketing campaigns to how our applications look, to how we do outreach, trying to sort of build on advances in science to help us understand how do we get folks to act. So I think there's a lot of inspiration everywhere, but I would say that I think there's a lot of inspiration in our field. And so as much as there is that we can learn by looking in other sectors, there's a lot that we should celebrate among ourselves. And I think that, I don't know that any other sector has all the answers for us. I think that among this room, among the organizations here, there are so many people doing great things. We should certainly look beyond ourselves, but we should look to each other as well. There's a lot we would benefit from.
And one other piece I would add to thinking about what else is out there. We typically don't think of higher education as being, a sector of innovation. But if you think about it, if you think about all the work that you all have been doing for however many number of years around academic expectations and college and career readiness, where do you think those young people are going? They're coming into the higher ed arena. And so higher education has had to innovate around how we actually receive students who have been in our programs or who are not by definition college ready, or they're coming from communities and schools and other places that have they're first in their families to go to college. And so there's been a lot of innovation in that sector and really focusing on outcomes and what we call success factors. And so that may be another place as you think about celebrating what's on the inside, that may be another place to also look as well. So we have time for a few more questions, or a couple more questions.
They
and
gave
we have
me a
someone here.
microphone. So, hi, I'm Sarah Pitcock with the National Summer Learning Association, and thank you for being here. And lunch is really good, so you have that to look forward to. I highly recommend the dessert. So it was interesting, Nadia, to hear your comment about the lack of investment in that sort of intermediary kind of role in education. And I was actually thinking, you know, we're a national intermediary organization. There are a variety of other national, state, and local intermediaries here in this room. And I do think in the expanded learning sector, there's a good amount of capacity in that area. And I just wondered if you could talk about the role that you think intermediary organizations play in scaling innovation, and knowing that investments for our work are very hard to come by. You know, any bright ideas you have for how we make the case for the value of the work that we do in scaling innovation.
Yeah, and please understand, my sort of reference certainly around saying that we haven't invested significantly in the infrastructure is not at all a reference to the quality of the work that the people in this room are undertaking in the slightest, but rather just to say sort of as a sector overall, as we kind of look at that landscape, that seems to be kind of an important gap. And I think you're right that it looks different for different topics and sort of different areas. So we may, you know, so there may be a better infrastructure around how we think about kind of the blending of informal and formal, or aligning of formal and informal learning context. There may be sort of better infrastructures around how we think about STEM. There's sort of different areas, there's always sort of different, the heat map looks a little different at any different point in time, and funding winds shift, and so different sectors, kind of different subsectors get built up over time. And so hear you kind of on all of those things. I think that I think there are a few different things that intermediate organizations do that are really important. I think that kind of in general, the one that we've been kind of hovering around is this kind of propagation function, sort of scaling function, however you want to think about it. But sort of an organization that has a view on sort of here are what some of these leading practices are, or here's somebody else that's tried this, and that also really understands the kind of day-to-day realities of people who are working with kids and families each day, and can help sort of translate, okay, here's a bunch of concepts, here's something that happened elsewhere, how do we translate this for your context, I think is incredibly important. And I think we sometimes, a little bit to your point earlier, Rich, I think we sort of say, hey, let's put out good information, and then let's hope that people make the right choices, and we sort of ignore the complex decision-making processes that people go through. And so people actually often make the rational choice. It just might not be the choice we thought they should have made. And those are different things, right? And it's sort of on us to actually better understand the behavioral science behind that, and sort of understand why people are making those choices. And I think that sort of intermediate organizations can actually help understand some of those dynamics and kind of uncover what's happening there, and help make different kinds of connections that we don't see if that doesn't happen. And I think for us, that's been a large part of the reason that we have really pushed different kinds of partnerships across different bodies of work. So we have, for example, just launched a recent partnership with the National Park Service, with NASA, and with the Institute of Museum and Library Studies. And we are, in the sort of idea is to give kids a range of hands-on science activities in communities across the country. So very different kind of partnership on our end. As we try to model the different kinds of partnerships that we are looking for you all to foster, whether that's researchers with school districts, whether that's sort of national nonprofits partnering with local nonprofits, and helping them think through both what they should be doing and how they could better structure their own internal operations. We very much are also trying to model that in terms of our own approach as well.
So I'm getting the red sign that we have no more time left. A couple of things just as takeaways for you. One, remember the the theme of this particular panel was on exploring the importance of innovation in the work that we do. And I think one major takeaway early on was that innovation is both a result and a process. And so what is our intentionality in the work that we're doing, be it as researchers, as programmers, as leaders, as advocates, as whatever role that we're as funders, what role do we play? How do we understand innovation as a system and not just as a process or a result? Another takeaway is this notion of replication and scale. And it may have a very different meaning for the environment in which you're serving. It doesn't necessarily mean that it has to be able to scale to the size of New York City so that it can serve 1 million young people. It could be to scale within the population or the demographic in which you're serving. And then I think another subset of that is thinking about it's not necessarily one organization's role to serve all, but as we think about this from a system perspective, how do you leverage the collective assets and the agency of the organizations who are driving towards more beneficial outcomes for a demographic or for a population? How do you leverage those assets in a way that really gives innovation in its true sense and a greater lift? And then I think the third takeaway from all of this is that there's a very particular role that we all play individually and collectively, and that it is that there's a leadership role that we play, there's a human capital role that we play in this process. Yes, we can leave it to others to facilitate, but it really, the question is, what is our role? How do the organizations that we represent, be it intermediaries, be it direct service providers, be it other organizations, what is our role in really affecting the greater good, the bigger part of this? So that it's not so much that we lose the game, but we had a triple, but that we won the game and that everyone had a chance to play well, and play strong. And so we thank you for your time this afternoon. I want to give a big, big thanks to Nadia and to Richard for spending time with us this afternoon. We thank you for your thoughtfulness. I know you still have plenty of questions that you would love to ask, but if you at least give us 15 minutes to eat, then we won't growl back at you. Thank you so much.
All right. So it's about 1:37 now. Ideally, we'd get started at 1:40 on the dot. Let's maybe stay focused on that 1:40 time and maybe just take a 3-minute break and reconvene quickly.